sold not as a company with physical things, but as a company in law. And it was sold for $2 billion to the Telefónica of Spain. Just the fact that we put it in a property title raised its value 36 times because it connected it. It connected it to shares. It connected it to investors. It connected it to everybody. Law connects. Today we have the possibility of a food shortage in the world. And now we know that there's 1,500,000,000 hectares that feed the world today. North America, Argentina, wherever you go. But where are we going to get the rest of the food? Well, there's over, according to the FAO, there's over 2,700,000 hectares that can produce more food. But they're in Africa, and they happen to be in Latin America. But they're untitled. In other words, nobody really knows who owns what. You send Indiana Jones and he'll find out an hectare at a time. But globally, to understand what's really going on, the problem is that nobody's going to invest unless they know who owns it or that they own it. Nobody's going to remove the rocks, nobody's going to put the irrigation systems or the roads until they feel they own it. So even the world food shortage problem is not an engineering problem. It's essentially a legal problem. And that goes for water as well. And when it refers to also money, I remember being called in by Alan Greenspan, former Federal Reserve Chief of the United States, at a certain moment where he wanted to talk to me about the book, and I said I would gladly do it if I could ask a couple of questions. For example, one question I asked was, how do you know how much money to issue, Mr. Greenspan? And he says, well, I have to see what the market does. And how do you do that? And he says, well, I go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, and I see how many people are buying and selling, and I make sure I've got just enough liquidity for that and for the credit. I said, very good, but then what are you seeing in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, what you see is basically the exchange of legal titles. It's not like in the days that John Wayne used to take all his steer all the way up to Chicago, so you sold a cow at a time. Today you have pieces of paper. You do not see in the London Metal Exchange people coming in with bars of gold or copper. You just see pieces of paper. In other words, he calculates the amount of money because he knows the amount of paper that is being traded. And I said, well, what happens in a country like mine where 60% of the population owns 70% of the goods, but there's no legal title to any? How do you calculate the amount of money you've got to put into the market? And he said, now that would be a problem. So even money comes from property and property law. You can't have money in a modern country without having property. And security is the same thing. The reason Osama bin Laden was able to find the Twin Towers is because it's a perfect address. You know where it is, you know how many people live there, you know its structural engineering points where you should hit. But you can't find Osama because he lives in a country without property. Without property, you have no security. You can't identify anybody. If you look at a Miami Vice program on television, it's two American cops, after generally a Peruvian like myself, who we're trying to find, and they go one address after an address. You can't do police work without addresses. If you have property, you have no addresses. The world hinges around the information that property brings into place, is what I'm trying to bring to you. What I'm also trying to tell you is that generally lawyers don't know this, but don't worry, economists don't either. And that's why it was called over many times the binding problem. In other words, what economists in Europe and the United States gave us over time was a sensation of where wealth came from. We're not too sure. Don't forget, Europeans have colonized the whole world, including Argentina, including Peru, including China. They colonized the whole world, and yet they haven't been able to leave behind the seeds of growth, which means that they probably also don't know why they're rich. So what we do know is that both Adam Smith and Marx said that wealth is due to the division of labor, at least partly. The division of labor means specialization. A pencil requires 160 different sources. The wood from Oregon, the graphite from Sri Lanka, you soften the lead or the graphite with Candelia wax, the eraser comes from Saudi Arabia, the little piece of metal that wraps the eraser to the pencil comes from copper of Chile, zinc from Peru, black nickel from Nigeria. All of these things make that some things come together. So the division of labor works because you have enough knowledge about the facts of where things are and how to commit people of different countries through legal instruments. So here's the question. If the division of labor works, how are things really brought together? How do facts come together? Well, both Wittgenstein, supposedly the world's greatest philosopher, and even Bertrand Russell, who could also probably have called the world's biggest philosopher as well, agreed that facts came in what they called atomic proportions, but that people never actually saw things in their little parts. In other words, you have, for example, the periodic table of 118 elements, hydrogen, nitrogen, zinc, whatever it is. But in effect, you never see these things in particular. You see things when they come together, when they combine. That's why you don't see the 160 parts of a pencil, you just see a pencil. Even myself, when I came into Argentina, and I was asked to identify myself, and I start saying, well, you know, I'm 1.79 meters, my father's Alberto, my mother's Rosa, I think we came from Spain, we don't really know. Some of us came from Italy. I have two brothers, my mother was related. He said, stop, show me your passport. And when I showed my legal document that is my passport, then he had a fact. In other words, my identity is not composed of microcosms. My identity is composed of a legal document that combines them in such a way that I am connected to the rest of society. Inside here, there's a photograph of me. There's biometric information that relates my nose to my eyes, the distance between my eyes and my nose, my address. I've got over 110 legal documents behind this passport that relate me to everything from the police station to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that connection is what produces the fact. As Wittgenstein said, facts are man-made. And what law do, whether lawyers know it or not, is you make pictures of facts, and you make it in legal documents. Without that, the global economy doesn't work, as I will try and prove as I get to the global crisis today. But it doesn't mean just getting facts in any old way. There is a tradition, there is a proper way of doing it. Property has got to be fixing things, and it's got to be fixing things in terms of their potential. It's got to be precise information. It's got to be as correct as my passport. It's got to be updated. It's got to be visa. It's got to integrate. It's got to have standards. You can't do anything without standards. Everybody has got to have the same standard documents. They cannot come as CDOs, as subprime qualities. They can't come as credit swaps. They've got to come in standard